This is the story of a nation that lost everything. A nation whose temple was burned, whose walls were torn down, whose people were marched in chains across the desert to a foreign land. This is the story of exile and return. It is not a story of quick victory or sudden triumph. It is the slow, painful work of rebuilding a life, a city, and a faith from the ashes. And it is not a story of human resilience alone, but of a God who keeps His covenant even when His people have broken it. For 70 years, the Jewish people lived as strangers in Babylon. They had no temple, no altar, no holy city. They hung their harps on the willows and wept when they remembered Zion. Generations were born who had never seen Jerusalem. Children grew up hearing stories of a home they had never known. The old ones died, still dreaming of a return that seemed impossible. But the prophets had spoken of an end to exile. Jeremiah had promised 70 years. Isaiah had named a deliverer before he was even born, a Persian king called Cyrus who would set the captives free. Then the world shifted. Babylon fell in a single night. The great empire that had seemed invincible crumbled before the armies of Persia. And on the throne of the world's new superpower sat a man named Cyrus. In the first year of his reign, Cyrus issued a decree that echoed across every province of the empire. "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and He has appointed me to build Him a temple in Jerusalem. Anyone among His people may go up." For the first time in 70 years, the gates of exile swung open. But returning was not simple. Many had built lives in Babylon. They had homes, businesses, children who knew no other land. The journey was long and dangerous. And what awaited them at the end was not a shining city, but a heap of rubble. Still, some rose to answer the call. Nearly 50,000 people gathered for the long march home. They carried with them the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had stripped from the temple decades before. They traveled with livestock, with servants, with everything they could carry. And they traveled with hope. The leader of this first wave was a man named Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David. At his side was Jeshua, the high priest. Together they would lead the people back to a land they barely remembered, to rebuild what had been destroyed. The journey took months. Across the desert, through hostile territories, past the ruins of cities that had once flourished. When they finally crested the last hill and looked down at Jerusalem, what they saw broke their hearts. The walls were gone. The great stones lay scattered like bones in the dust. Where the temple had stood, there was nothing but charred foundation and overgrown weeds. The city that had once been the joy of the whole earth was a ghost of itself. Some wept, others stood in silence. The old ones who remembered the glory of Solomon's temple could not reconcile their memories with this desolation. But they had not come this far to despair. The first month, when the autumn festivals drew near, the people gathered as one in Jerusalem. Zerubbabel and Jeshua built an altar on the site where the temple had once stood. They could not yet build the temple, but they could restore the sacrifices. For the first time in 70 years, burnt offerings rose from the holy hill of Jerusalem. The smoke climbed into the sky like a signal fire. "We are here. We have returned. We have not forgotten." Fear surrounded them on every side. The peoples of the land watched with suspicion and hostility. The Jews were strangers in their own homeland, vulnerable and few. But even in their fear, they kept the altar fires burning. Morning and evening, the sacrifices continued. The rhythm of worship that had been silenced for generations began again. They also celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles, living in temporary shelters as their ancestors had done in the wilderness. It was a reminder that they were still pilgrims, still wanderers, still waiting for the fullness of God's promise. As the months passed, preparations began for the greater task ahead. Funds were raised, supplies were gathered. Cedar logs were brought from Lebanon, carried by sea to Joppa, and then overland to Jerusalem, just as Solomon had done centuries before. In the second year after their return, the foundation of the new temple was laid. It was a day of ceremony and shouting. The priests stood in their robes, blowing trumpets. The Levites clashed cymbals and sang the ancient songs of David. The people raised their voices in praise. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. But the celebration was not unmixed. The older priests and leaders, those who had seen the first temple in its glory, wept aloud when they saw the new foundation. It was smaller, simpler, a pale shadow of what had been. The sound of weeping and the sound of joy mingled together, until no one could tell them apart. The noise carried far across the hills, and the surrounding peoples heard it and wondered what was happening in the ruins of Jerusalem. They would not wonder for long. Enemies were gathering, plots were forming. The fragile hope of the returned exiles would soon be tested by opposition, by threats, by enemies within and without. The temple was not yet built. The walls were still broken. And the people of God stood in the ruins of their holy city, caught between memory and hope, between the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. This was restoration, but it was fragile, incomplete, a beginning, not an ending. The prophets had spoken of a greater return, a fuller redemption that still lay beyond the horizon. This is only the beginning. Thank you for listening to this episode of Exile and Return. If this story of loss, hope, and fragile new beginnings was meaningful to you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with others who might find it valuable. In the next episode, the returned exiles face fierce opposition as they try to rebuild the temple. Enemies scheme, construction halts, and the people must decide whether to give up or press on through the darkness.